Hello again, YouTube. This is Mazda with another video in my new series in which I attempt to teach amateur and intermediate iOS developers how to do various tasks using the iOS SDK. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a customized UITableViewCell. So, the standard UITableViewCell is good for a lot of things. It's probably good for most things that you could think of doing with a table view. But there are definitely a very large number of situations and scenarios where the default UITableViewCell is not adequate for what you're trying to accomplish in your app. So I'm going to keep it simple for now. There are two ways to customize a table view cell. The first way is to, within the cell4row@indexPath method, to add some custom subviews. And if you write your code appropriately, then your subviews will also be reusable as part of the reusable table view cell, and you won't have created unnecessary instances of whatever subviews you create. For example, a slider or a button or even an image view, and actually most commonly probably a UI label instance. And then the other way is to create a subclass of UITableViewCell. In this video, I'm going to do it all in the cell4row@indexPath method, just because I found that when you don't have a lot of subviews, when it's not very much customization, it saves time and unnecessary code by just keeping it in the cell4row@indexPath method. However, when you have a very customized UITableViewCell, and even one that you might be using in other table views and even possibly other applications, you'll probably want to make a UITableViewCell subclass. So I'm probably going to make another video showing how to do that. But in this video, I'm just going to stick to keeping it simple and doing everything in the table view data source methods. So as always, let's begin by creating a new Xcode project. And I'm going to call it custom table view. Alright, so let's first begin by setting up our standard table view. So we're going to go to the viewcontroller.zip file. Okay, and let's drag from the objects pane a table view onto the view, and we're going to save it. Okay, and so let's drag our data source and delegate methods. Actually, we're not going to make any use of the delegate. Okay, so we have our outlet set. Let's save. And so let's go to viewcontroller.m. And we're going to keep this simple because stuff like this, some people get intimidated because even though it's elegant and simple in principle, sometimes in practice things get a little messy and you're kind of at a loss for how to do something. And a lot of the times what people don't understand when writing iOS apps is usually the solution is as simple as you're thinking about it logically. But if you don't know your way around the API very well, then you can get lost easily. So let's implement our standard 3 data source methods. The first being number of sections in table view. We're going to return 1. Next, our table view number of rows in section. So here, let's return 10. We'll make a table view with 10 rows. And now here's where the customization is going to come in. So we need to implement, of course, our cell4row@indexPath method. All right. So first, let's set everything up as it would be in a standard implementation. So we're going to make that table view cell instance. We're going to call to the DQ reusable cell with identifier method. If it returns no, we have to create a cell for use and reuse. So we're going to initialize it with the default table view cell style because everything's gonna be customized. We're not gonna use the default text label or the detail text label. So I guess essentially it doesn't really matter which style we initialize it with, but since the other styles have more subviews, more labels, whatever, image view, we're going to go with the simplest one, so we don't have any unnecessary subviews automatically created upon initialization. And so cell.text label text, we're going to set the text equal to, just so we can, just to make sure everything's right here, index path row actually of this cell %d, and let's just pass in index path.row, and then we'll return the cell. So let's just make sure everything is set up right so far. I have a drink here I'm going to sip on occasionally. I hope it doesn't make too much noise. Okay, cool. So, as we had hoped, we have a table view with 10 rows, and each row's text is according to whatever row that cell is in. So let's quit. And so now let's add some. Let's get to the customizing part. So first we want, how about a switch, a UI switch, at the right end of the cell. So let's comment this out. We don't want that text there. And first we have to declare a UISwitch instance. Now UISwitch, if you don't already know, is a very simple object which serves one purpose, to be on or off for some setting. So we're going to initialize it to nil at first. Okay, and so now you see here that in the case that this if statement is true, that means that we have not yet created any UITableViewCell object for the table view, which also means that we are on the first row of the first section. So when we create the cell instance, we also want to create any subview instances, and we need to set this up so that the subviews are also reusable, so that we're not creating unnecessary duplicates or instances of, for in this case, our switch. So if we were to initialize the switch here outside of that if statement, in fact, if we were to do it up here, UISwitch cgrec0, so this will create a UI switch, and when we pass in cgrec0, that tells the UI switch to initialize itself with the default, as defined by the API references or whatever, the default dimensions for a UI switch. And I don't think you would ever really want to, or I've never seen a situation where you'd want to change those, because it's about as compact as you would want a switch to be by default. So we've created our switch. Now, in the way that we've done this here, every time that this method is called, which in our case will be called 10 times, one for all 10 rows, or one for each of the 10 rows, you can see that we will have created another instance every time this is called. So by the time that our table view has drawn itself completely, we will have created 10 instances of our UI switch object. And 10 is not a terrible amount. In fact, you probably wouldn't see any big noticeable lag or performance change while running the app. But what if you had a table view with 100 rows and you created 100 switches? That's a lot of memory, and it's completely unnecessary to do that, and it's just bad practice, really. So we need to set this up so that when we create that first cell, we also create only one switch, and then we can reuse that switch when we draw the other cells. Okay, so we're going to cut this out here, and we're going to leave it so that when we declare it, it's nil. So now, when we create our cell, let's also create the switch. So the switch equals, and so now here we've initialized the switch object. Now the trick here, the next part, is basically the trick behind making subviews reusable. Because we're not making a subclass of UITableViewCell, we need a way to access this switch from the subsequent calls to cell forward index path method. Obviously, for the first call, we have access to it. It's right there. We just created it. But what about the second time this is called? This if statement will return false, and we won't have created a new switch. So how can we get back to the switch we created the first time this was run? And the trick is real simple. We give the switch a tag. UI views and all UI view subclasses in iOS can have a tag, which is some integer from, I think it could be actually anything from 0 to int max. So let's just put a tag of 100. Okay. And so now here's the second part of the trick. In the case that we already have a cell instance, in the case that this doesn't return nil, which will be row 1 and on, or the second row and on all the way up to 9 or 10, depending on if you're talking about index or just plain number, we can get back, we can grab that switch like so. Cell content view, view with tag 100. And so now we add the switch as a subview to the cell's content view. And so now in this else part of the if statement, the second time this method is called and all the way up to the 10th time, this will return the switch that we created here. See, we're asking the cell's content view for a view with the tag 100, and we set that tag as 100 right here. So it's actually really simple. And so now we can use that switch. So let's just run this and see what this looks like. Cool. So as we would expect, we have 10 rows, each with one switch. But now we need to make the state of each individual switch persistent. But now we have a problem here. So because cells are reusable, if we have, let's try 20 cells, and we run the app again. All right, so now let's set 3 in a row off, and now let's do some scrolling. You see that it gets all messed up because the cells are being reused. So in the first it was off, so it gets reused here, and even though we set it on, it says it's off. And now because this one was on, it's reused, it tells us this one gets put on, and it's all out of whack, and we need to fix this. So let's quit our app, and the way we can do this is with an array. We store an array, and we're going to have 20 objects in the array, one for each row, and in that array we'll store the state, the on-off state of our switch. Okay, so let's make an array, and we're going to call it switch states. And we can initialize it in the view did load, that's fine. Switch states equals NSArray. Actually, let's make it mutable so we can save some time here. Actually, it has to be mutable so we can change it later on. Switch states equals, we're going to initialize a mutable array. A mutable array is an array that you can change, replace objects, insert objects, delete objects, so on and so forth. And we'll have a nice little for statement. For I equals 0, I is less than 20, I plus plus, and for 0 to 20, we're going to add a string that says off. Okay, so by default, when we first launch the app, all 20 switches will be off. Okay, now we need to add some kind of logic so that when a switch in a row is turned on, we change the switch state here. We save it in our array so that later on when the user scrolls up and down, it doesn't get distorted or put to a state that it shouldn't have been, and the user gets all confused. And worse than that, the app just doesn't work. Okay, so we need to respond to the user changing the switch. We need some action that when the user changes it, we appropriately respond and save the new switch state and the correct index in this switch states array. Okay, so let's give the switch an action. The switch add target self at selector switch changed, and we need a colon here because when the switch is changed and this method is called switch change, it's going to pass in itself, and we need the instance of switch that was called because we need to know which row that switch is on, which row the switch that was just changed is on, so we can save the appropriate state in our array. And for UI control event value changed. Okay, so now we just added an action that the switch will call to this object. Since we set the target to self, it'll call switch change, pass itself in, and it'll call that method when its value has changed. So either it's gone from on to off or from off to on. Now let's implement that method. So the sender here is the switch that was changed. Okay, so first, just to make sure we've got our logic right, let's make sure that we can grab the index path of the switch that was changed. So we need a link to our table view so we can call to it to grab the right index path of the cell that owns the switch that was changed. So we need to add an IV outlet here in our .h. I'm going to call it main table view just so that there's no confusion for the compiler since we use table view in all these methods. We'll connect that. I did that by right-clicking and dragging. Okay, so main table view, index path for cell. And so now we need to grab the cell that this switch belongs in or exists in. We'll call it the parent cell equals, and so now sender superview and superview again. Now the reason we called a superview twice is because, as you can see here, when we add the switch as a subview to the cell, we don't actually add it as a subview to the cell, but we add it to the cell's content view. The content view belongs in the cell, and the switch belongs in the content view. So when we call to superview once, we receive a pointer to the content view of the cell, and then when we call to superview again, we receive a pointer to the cell itself. And then we can pass that in here, the parent cell. Okay, so this is a really nifty method that when we call it to a table view instance, it will return the index path for a cell object, any cell we pass in, and it can tell us exactly which row the cell is on. And so now just to make sure, let's log using nslog the index path of the switch %d and index path of switch.row. So let's just make sure that this works correctly. Okay, so let's change it from on to off. Good. Index path of the switch 0. Good. So that's the 0th row. Now let's try the 5th row. 4. Good. So it's working. 7, and the last one we should get 19. Perfect. Okay. So now we can close that. So now, instead of just logging uselessly, we're going to change the value of the index in the switch state that the switch corresponds with. So switch states, so we're going to do an if statement. If sender on, so if the switch is now on, switch states replace object at index path of switch.row with object on. Else, if the switch was turned off, switch states replace object at index path of row.row with object off. And now to complete this logic, here, back in our self-row index path method, right before displaying the cell with its switch, we're going to set its on or off state. Switch states object at index path.row. So if is equal to string on, the switch on equals yes, else the switch on equals no. Now let's run it. Alright, so let's set the first 3 to on. Scroll down, scroll back up. Oh, they're still on. Good. Let's set the first 6 to on. Scroll down, scroll back up. They're still on. Let's set the last 3 to on. Scroll up, scroll down, and they're still on. So this is working exactly as we had hoped. And just for some minor cosmetics, let's move that switch to a more appropriate area. I want it on the right, so let's move it there. So cgrect, we're going to grab the current frame of the switch, switch.frame, and now frame origin x, let's try 290, and frame origin y, let's try 8, and give that new frame, that modified frame, back to the switch. Let's try that. Oops. Okay, it's a little too far. Let's pull it back. Let's try 230. Maybe down 1 pixel. And over to the right, let's try 2. That looks good. And so now you can see that you can add any kind of subview that you want. It doesn't have to be a switch. It can be an image. It can be another label. It can be a button. Anything your heart desires. And that is a basic example of how to customize a table view cell in iOS. Hope you learned a lot. Thanks for watching, and tune into my next video.